If you pass this bill, Bill C5, that it will be a long, hot summer.
Well, while we support efforts to protect Canada from geopolitical and economic uncertainty, First Nations are very concerned that this federal proposal has the potential to violate many collective rights of First Nations, respecting our lands, our waters, resources, inherent title rights, jurisdiction in our treaties. First Nations, I've told the Prime Minister, will require clarification respecting the design of Crown First Nations engagement and consultation timelines and how rights holders will be invited to respond to the Crown on this matter. Like First Nations, need to know that. And the rights of First Nations are under international law and the Constitution of Canada are at stake. So if free, prior, and informed consent is not obtained from First Nations, this legislation will be marred and mirrored in conflict and protracted litigation.
The premiers are meeting with the Prime Minister today to talk about some of these proposed projects. Should First Nations be part of those meetings?
They absolutely should have been. I know that national chiefs, all national chiefs before me have always stated that they should have been there. First Nations should be there and have a full seat at the table. It just seems like, it's always trying to leave First Nations out and coming to us at the last minute and saying, okay, let's work on this together. And that's not a way to work this country. This country, if they look back historically, every time that, when we don't work together right away, things become mirrored in conflict. And if this country wants to do better, they should have had a full seat at the table for First Nations.
In your letter to the PM, you said that this kind of legislation could be a serious threat to First Nations. We're seeing provinces trying to push similar legislation. How concerning is all of that for you?
Well, if the national vision from Canada for First Nations, say infrastructure, is going to be focused exclusively on accessing natural resources, First Ministers need to rethink and broaden their perspectives. I'll say this further. I think Canada needs to start with fast-tracking basics like clean water to our First Nations people, quality housing, modern schools. Many of our kids, their schools need to be fixed, or they need bigger schools because our demographics are growing every year. They need all-season roads and community infrastructure. And last week, King Charles III, of course, he read the speech from the throne and said governments need to honor truth and reconciliation in both word and in deed. And in a country as rich as Canada, the shameful gap must be closed once and for all when it comes to infrastructure. And this is the mother of all Canadian infrastructure and reconciliation projects. So if we want to talk about that, let's talk about the basics for First Nations people.
Quickly, on another note, many provinces have thousands of people, many First Nations under evacuation. Some concerns have been raised in Manitoba over how things are playing out. What have you been hearing when it comes to the evacuation process?
Absolutely. Look, I think that the provinces need to make sure that they're making sure that First Nations leadership is listened to. And I know that there's lots of work being done all weekend. Look, I rolled my sleeves and helped this weekend too, and helped with some families where I could. And we're in this together. I know it's Mother Nature, but at the same time, there's probably so many lessons learned, but at the same time, trying to work together to make sure that our people are getting to safety as they should. It's still very much in crisis mode, and making sure that if you have conferences and if you have hockey games or other hockey tournaments, and I know that that's the Canadian way, but the Canadian way is also that we help each other. And I think that if, we're hearing the scarcity of hotel rooms, especially across the prairies, and, many people being pushed to hundreds of thousands, thousands of kilometers away in other hotels just to find hotel rooms. I think that that's disheartening for many families in a crisis. And, I think making sure that we listen to the leadership and making sure that we try and work together and being in constant communication. I know I want to uplift our leadership for We've seen this before. Unfortunately, the 2011 flood, the 2019 ice storm, the 2020, the 2020 to 2020, pandemic, when the pandemic started. And we've seen this time and time again. And, First Nations need to be better equipped. We keep pushing for it. And Canada needs to come to the table and have a real talk about, emergency management and making sure that First Nations are more equipped to deal with that. We keep pushing for it, and First Nations are doing the best with what they have, and they have very little. They're stretching it far and helping each other. And so I lift the leadership up from right across the country, helping each other, offering support. And, I think there's so many lessons to be learned in this, but at the same time, in the meantime, to make sure that people are getting to safety and making sure that we, what's our next game plan, right? Where that we provide that support to the nations. So thank you.
Thank you for your time today, National Chief.
Yeah, thank you.
We discussed a wide range of potential nation-building projects, including, and this is far from exhaustive, the Western and Arctic Corridor, which, amongst other things, connects energy, critical minerals, and trade infrastructure, the Eastern Energy Partnership, critical minerals pathways, which include a range of critical mineral projects that premiers can speak to, the next stage of nuclear, from uranium to SMRs to large-scale nuclear, and a series of infrastructure investments for export diversification from ports to rails to last-mile roads.
The premiers began arriving at TCU Place in Saskatoon yesterday with their priorities in their pockets. To be considered of national interest, projects had to strengthen Canada's autonomy, provide clear economic benefits, have high success potential, and support clean technology. When it was all over, neither the Prime Minister nor the premiers would say which projects would be moving forward. Prime Minister Carney said that was simply because there just wasn't enough time to discuss each project without overshadowing others.
There is a long list of projects that bring the country together, diversify our markets, make us more resilient, create good jobs and growth, have very good prospects of Indigenous partnerships and beyond.
Premier Danielle Smith says she looks forward to partnering with the federal government and the other premiers to help Alberta's oil and other natural resources support Canada's goal of being the strongest economy in the G7.
Have to address issues, of course, of Indigenous ownership and equity partnership. You have to address issues, of course, of emissions and other environmental issues. But that's what I heard, is how do we have an all-of-the-above approach? And I think that's very encouraging.
The press conference ended with Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew addressing the ongoing wildfire crisis affecting the prairie provinces.
I want to say thank you. And it's in these moments of emergency and in these moments of crisis where you see the true nature of Canadians shine through. And I think that we need to be proud of that and to take a moment to thank folks for stepping up in the way that they have through our state of emergency.
The leaders of Canada's Indigenous groups were not at the meeting, but the consensus among the premiers and Carney was that whatever nation-building projects went ahead, they must do so with Indigenous input. Rachel May, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
Thanks for joining us. National Chief, you met with the Prime Minister yesterday to discuss the proposed fast-track legislation. How did that go?
Well, we've just received a copy of this proposed bill, and our legal team will review the draft, and we will provide a full response over the coming days. Over the coming days, we will also organize a meeting of the AFN executive and invite chiefs to attend a national online forum to review the bill. We appreciate Prime Minister Carney reaching out yesterday to explain his government's plan to define and fast-track strategic national infrastructure projects through legislation. I had said to the Prime Minister that First Nations support efforts to protect Canada from economic uncertainty and advance resource revenue sharing agreements. However, First Nations are very concerned that this proposal may violate collective rights. These have only increased given the approaches taken to these bills in Ontario, in British Columbia, and of course the Alberta Premier's public statements about separation from Canada. That is why it is so important that Parliament and the Senate take the time needed to ensure that First Nations and rights holders have an opportunity to properly review speak, and propose improvements to this legislation before it is passed. We fear that attempts to ram legislation through Parliament may have significant consequences. The rights of First Nations under international law, the United Nations Declaration Act, and the Constitution of Canada are at stake. And failure to obtain free, prior, and informed consent will likely result in protracted litigation. During my discussions with the Prime Minister yesterday, we were also pleased to restate that the significant nation-building opportunities associated with finally closing Canada's long-standing and shameful First Nations infrastructure gap. This gap has perpetuated deep-rooted inequality in our country, in Canada, and led to poorer health outcomes, limited education opportunities, and less prosperity for First Nations compared with other Canadians. So we will continue inviting the Prime Minister to take this opportunity to use this legislation to finally fast-track modern schools for First Nations kids, clean water, quality housing, access to high-speed internet, all-season roads, and vital community infrastructure for First Nations. Closing the First Nations infrastructure gap will strengthen Canada's autonomy, resilience, and security, and it will provide significant economic and social benefits to Canada.
Thank you for your time today, National Chief.
Thank you.
Bill C5, an act to enact the Free Trade and Labour Mobility in Canada Act, and the Building Canada Act be disposed.
Assistant Deputy Speaker John Nader gave notice Friday morning that the government plans to move the One Canadian Economy Act to third reading by next Friday. Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc is the sponsor of the bill. He said U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff threats necessitate a tight timeline, but Indigenous rights will still be respected.
Every major project advanced through the changes proposed in Bill C5 will require real partnerships with Indigenous peoples. We've already announced that we're setting up an Indigenous Advisory Council. We will ensure that self-determination, inclusion, and respect are at the heart of this process.
The legislation does a number of things, including giving the government the ability to fast-track energy pipelines. By streamlining the approval process through one office and reducing the time frame to do this from 5 to 2 years. But the Assembly of First Nations says things are moving too fast and the Liberals need to take the necessary time to do proper consultations. Bloc Québécois MP Sébastien Lemire pressed the government on how quickly the legislation is moving.
Indigenous people are being called on to play ball. And when you're given 5 days to study a bill, and when you're saying that we consulted the First Nations, in my mind, that's not consultation. Not each First Nation was not consulted.
In response, LeBlanc reassured that consultations will take place, but only after a project of national interest is chosen.
And then would allow the government and the private sector to conduct exactly that in-depth consultation. So here we're talking about, we're currently building something, but before a project is designated or approved, obviously those consultations will take place.
Speaking to media outside the House of Commons on Friday, Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet said the government is massively increasing its powers while subverting parliamentary process at the same time.
How could we go forward with such a huge bill, with huge consequences for Quebec and Canada, without at least do what we have been elected to do? And that means studying thoroughly this bill in committee. The government seems to want to avoid scrutiny on the bill.
The AFN is set to host a virtual meeting on C5 with First Nations leaders from across the country on Monday. As well, debate will continue on the proposed legislation the same day. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Hundreds came to the lawn of Parliament. They're here to call on the government to kill Bill C5. Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler wasted no words in his message to Prime Minister Mark Carney.
That if you pass this bill, Bill C5, that it will be a long, hot summer. Because we will not sit idly by and watch any government whether it's Ontario or Canada, to come into our territory and take whatever or whenever they want it, because it is ours.
Bill C-5 is currently being pushed through Parliament with very little consultation with First Nations. Last week, Prime Minister Carney said Parliament would sit until the bill is passed. It would allow the federal government to fast-track major infrastructure projects deemed in the national interest. One way is by reducing the requirements for environmental assessments. That's why 19-year-old Jessica George made the 6-hour trek from Oneida First Nation.
I think it's important to protect our land and our waters because that's one of the most crucial parts of our culture is to protect our lands and the water.
NDP MP Saul Mamikol also came in a show of support. He said First Nations need to be a part of any discussion when it affects treaty rights, land rights, and the people that live on the lands. He said communities will rise up against Ontario's Bill 5 and the proposed federal bill.
And I think, you will see different direct actions from different areas. And one of the things is, there'll be obviously some peaceful demonstrations. But I think if there's no, pullback of the bill or repealing of the bill or killing the bills, I think things will just elevate slowly throughout the summer. To go along the river.
Raymond Katakwapa is from Attawapiskat First Nation. He told the crowd the Anishinaabe Aski Nation Youth Council is starting a movement with youth across the country to make change.
Not be the same as I Don't Know More, KI6, 1492 and back. This will be different and real change will be made. Because we're not only building on top of what our predecessors have built for us, but we're going to the moon this time. And I believe in this generation.
Today,
according to the people here, actions like this will continue throughout Ontario and the rest of the country. Annette Francis, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Bill's third reading, projet de loi, troisième lecture, number 1, Bill C-5.
Prince Edward Island Mi'kmaq Senator Brian Francis spoke for more than 40 minutes on why he would not support the legislation. He said the bill is moving ahead too quickly and not in the spirit of reconciliation.
Why are we rushing on such a consequential bill that deserves care and attention? We had the option to slow down. That was the message delivered clearly by National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nepanek last week. She asked us to take the time to do things properly and reminded us that is how we build a better country. By listening, by working together, and by not rushing reconciliation.
Nova Scotia Senator Paul Prosper, who is also Mi'kmaq, spoke for more than half an hour on the bill. He said his office has received racist threats because he questions the legislation.
When I came out against the rushed nature of this bill and spoke about the need to amend or even delay its passage, a racist vitriol and threats to my office was experienced. It was so intense, some staff asked for permission to not pick up unknown phone calls. This isn't right.
Alberta Senator Patty Laboucaine-Benson is Métis. She said the Trump tariff threats necessitate the quick passage of the bill and that Indigenous consultation will happen on a project-by-project basis.
I understand the impulse to want to slow things down, but we really are at a moment of potential crisis. As the president of the Manitoba Métis Federation put it, we're facing the threat of economic war and the risk of Canada's economic engine to break apart, and in a way that will harm low-income and vulnerable Canadians the most. There will have to be consultation on projects. That's where the consultation has to happen.
Nova Scotia Senator Colin Deacon added Prime Minister Mark Carney has been firm that projects will not move forward without Indigenous support.
The PM has really put forward, the Prime Minister has put forward a really clear precondition on any project that he wants to consider under Part 2, which is that First Nations, it has to have Indigenous support.
Is it your pleasure, honourable senators, to adopt the motion?
In the end, the bill passed third reading without amendments. It will now go to Governor General Mary Simon for royal assent. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa. Toronto Metropolitan University professor Pam Palmater had some strong words for both Prime Minister Mark Carney and the Liberal government.
I think the government has approached this entirely the wrong way, whether you're looking at it through a legal, economic, or social lens. I mean, this bill is clearly unconstitutional. I think it's violating a whole series of federal laws, including C-15, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
At a press conference on Parliament Hill Friday, former Ontario NDP MP Charlie Angus also said the Prime Minister needs to do better.
I think he made a serious mistake in C5 when you do not include Indigenous communities in the consultations, when you think you can override Indigenous rights. You're setting yourself up for failure. And I can tell you from coming and representing Treaty 9 for many years that the communities are not very pleased, and Mr. Carney is going to have to do better if he's going to do this in the long term.
The Liberals have insisted they need the One Canadian Economy Act to be law by July 1st in order to deal with the unprecedented threat of U.S. President Donald Trump and his tariffs. But a number of Indigenous groups have continued to say the legislation was passed without proper consultation. Manitoba Métis Federation President David Chartrand said his organization supports the law in principle, but they too have concerns.
The issue I did have of needing more clarity was to ensure that consultation still must take place. It must. There's got to be a dialogue that happens between us, the government of Canada, and the proprietor and the partner and private sector. So that's going to be something that we anticipate the promise to be working throughout the summer with us. The second piece to that is this Indigenous Advisory Committee. I want to make sure, of course, the Red River is sitting on that board.
Carney has committed to full-day engagement sessions with Indigenous groups on the legislation, beginning with First Nations on July 17th. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Mario, thanks so much for being with us. Can you tell us about some of the projects that might be viewed as in the national interest in northern Manitoba?
Certainly can, and it's a pleasure to be here, first of all. I think we've all heard in recent weeks the Prime Minister's plans for nation-building projects. And I think the University of Manitoba, and Manitoba in particular as a province, are well situated because of our past relationships that we've built together with Indigenous communities, with industry, with government partners to really build sustained partnerships that we think will serve us well, to solve some problems of substance, both for Indigenous peoples, but also for non-Indigenous peoples.
Can you tell us about those projects?
Certainly. I think one of our major projects is providing accessibility to the Arctic. And we've been on this for several years now, with special emphasis on connectivity, bringing peoples together to ensure safety of trappers and hunters on the ice, for example, and to ask the question, how can we contribute further to economic development and economic reconciliation with Indigenous peoples? So we work closely with the Dene and Cree in the Churchill area and with the Inuit peoples in the Western Hudson Bay.
Now, Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew has been taking some heat recently about support for bigger energy projects. So what's your sense of support among First Nations for projects that you're working on and have mentioned?
Well, I think the key is to do this with full consultation and complete sensitivity for the biosphere, right? So two very important things. And that comes back to our sustained partnerships, our deep relationships. One has to build trust. So nothing without full consent and full participation. So in fact, University of Manitoba researchers are the supporting cast, providing information and research on, for example, the best routes, minimum damage to the biosphere, right? Assessing the impact of oil spills, designing systems that will minimize oil spills. And if there are oil spills, how does one mitigate that? So new methods of cleanup. So I think one has to be cognizant of the fact that these could harm the environment, these high energy projects. But if done intelligently and with sensitivity, full consultation, one can arrive at a common solution. I should point out that this does not refer only to fossil fuels. In the future, we will be transporting other forms of energy. For example, green ammonia, where one can liquefy that as a carrier of hydrogen and transport it to various centers, various countries. And so the Port of Churchill then becomes a very important asset when one wants to do that. So the key is to be very aware of the possible harm that can be done. We enlist our conservation biologists, our anthropologists, and consistent with our strategic research plan, where one of the themes is human rights and social justice. So we would never want to go against that ideology.
Just really quickly here, Mario, obviously the federal government seems to be in a rush here, passing legislation to get things moving quickly. How quickly could some of these projects get off the ground?
Well, I think it comes back to answer the question, I have to talk about climate change, right? With the global warming, the Hudson Bay is navigable now for about 5.5 months of the year. Our researchers have modeled the future impacts of climate change, and they predict that by 2100 we'll have 7 to 9 months of navigable water. So that combined with icebreakers, for example, more resistant ships, really opens up the shipping season. So I don't want to raise expectations falsely, but a great deal of research has to be done in the feasibility of the port. One may have to do a little bit more dredging. One may have to relocate certain components, but we're certainly well on track to study those effects and to make reasonable predictions going forward. We don't want to rush this. We have to make sure that we have, for example, a contiguous path for open water vessels that will also minimize harm to the biosphere. Right? So I think all those considerations may slow things down a little bit, but we have tremendous teams ready to work and in partnership with our Indigenous colleagues.
Mario, we'll have to leave it there, but appreciate you enlightening us on some of the work that's underway.
My pleasure. Please call on me anytime.
The Prime Minister kept his opening remarks fairly short, saying it was a great honor and pleasure to open the summit. Yesterday, chiefs expressed concerns about the speed at which C5 had been passed and how fast this meeting was set up. Assembly of First Nations National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Neepanak also said that she hopes that Carney brings forward new infrastructure plans for First Nations. Carney says the Bill C5 legislation is needed to counter economic threats from U.S. President Donald Trump and insisted today's meeting was just the first step in a process, something he talked about during a very brief press conference beforehand.
Today we'll be talking about building in partnership with First Nations, in some cases in partnership, in some cases with projects led by First Nations. Today is about the how, not the what. We're not yet at the what stage. We're not yet at the what stage of which projects and how exactly the conditions associated with those projects.
Inuit leaders had a lot to discuss during a meeting with Prime Minister Mark Carney early Thursday. Along with the One Canadian Economy Act, or Bill C5, the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee has identified 14 priority areas they want to work on with Canada.
Whether it be the Child First Initiative, the ongoing housing crisis, and the necessary actions to resolve it, the work that still needs to be done on education and on language and infrastructure. All of these things I hope we can have fulsome conversations about today.
Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami President Natan Obed co-chaired the meeting, saying having it so soon after the federal election shows the government's willingness to work with Inuit. Going in with a third of his cabinet to discuss Bill C5, Carney said it was a charged agenda.
This opportunity to build major projects, nation-building projects across Inuit Nunavut, across the Northwest Territories, across Canada, in partnership. So that will be the core of our discussions today, but as well we'll address issues around Arctic security, defense, and education, health, social services for our people.
C5 has been widely controversial throughout Canada, with fears that it threatens Indigenous sovereignty. But after the meeting, Obed said he felt reassured the bill will not violate modern treaties.
I'm really optimistic about the ability for Canada to respect our agreements in this implementation phase of Bill C5. But still, these are early days, and we look forward to the conversations ahead.
Northern and Arctic Affairs Minister Rebecca Chartrand shared what was said to calm Obed's fears.
What we told Natan Obed is that these processes have already been established. So when we look at the modern treaties, we know that we have to abide by the regulatory and the environmental assessments, and that's what we're going to do.
Virginia Mearns, an Inuk from Nunavut, was also announced as the new Arctic ambassador. Obed said he personally recommended her for the role and is very pleased with her appointment. Sav Jonesa, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
This past spring, the Liberal government pushed through Bill C5, the Building Canada Act. Amongst his advisory, there are 2 representatives from north of 60. Notably, both Saskatchewan and Quebec have 2 representatives each, while British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, and Nova Scotia each have 1 representative. Some backlash is underway in Manitoba today as the lone representative who comes from the Manitoba Métis Federation. The Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs says the voices and decision-making authority of First Nations in Manitoba have been ignored. In a statement, Grand Chief Kyra Wilson said, "There are nation-building projects that will affect our lands, our waters, and our future generations. They cannot advance on the basis of advisory councils crafted in Ottawa." Métis Nation Alberta is also among those expressing their disappointment in not having a seat on the council and calling for that to be rectified.
5 projects will be immediately referred to the Major Project Office for consideration. Top of that list is the expansion of the LNG Canada Phase 2 in Kitimat, British Columbia, which includes involvement from the Haida First Nation. No new oil pipelines or enhancements of infrastructure into Northern Ontario's critical mineral-rich Ring of Fire are mentioned. The Prime Minister said none of the major projects will move ahead unless they advance the interests of Indigenous peoples.
To be in Canada's national interest, a major project must strengthen Canada's autonomy, our resilience, and our security. It must have clear benefits for Canadians. It must have a high likelihood of being completed. It must contribute to clean growth in Canada's climate goals. And it must advance the interests of Indigenous peoples.
In addition to the 5 projects being announced on Thursday for referral to the Major Project Office, the feds identified strategic areas of focus they say will be transformative for Canada. Among them is the Port of Churchill. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew called it a great day for Churchill, Manitoba, and Canada.
One of the things that I really appreciated seeing the federal government talk about today, the Prime Minister mentioning in particular, but also their news release, is the idea of icebreakers being in Hudson Bay to help us have year-round shipping seasons here. Now, there's a lot of work that's going to have to happen. We got to think about wildlife, environment. Our Indigenous partner governments are going to have a lot of input in this process.
Part of the Major Projects Office includes an Indigenous Advisory Council that was announced Wednesday evening. 11 representatives from across the country will sit on the council. British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia have 1 seat each on the council. Both Saskatchewan and Quebec have 2, and the remaining 2 advisors are from the north. Reaction to the Advisory Council and the list of projects has been swift.
And so when I think about any projects that come through Manitoba, you will have to talk to our First Nations leadership first before you enter into our territories. Without that permission, you won't be coming into the region.
Canoe feels it was a missed opportunity not to include a First Nations representative from Manitoba on the advisory council.
The MMF is going to have a role as a Métis government, but the First Nations have to be given that opportunity to engage. They have to have inclusion. So again,
Dennis Ward, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
L'honorable ministre des Finances.
Finance Minister François Philippe Champagne's opening remarks to the House of Commons defined the 2025 budget as a transformational one.
This budget must be generational in its ambition and serve to shape our economy and our nation's future. Il n'y a pas de place pour le retrait, l'ambiguïté.
There is no place for withdrawal, ambiguity, or even standing still. Only for bold and swift action.
Bold and swift action is what is needed. To weather the storm of uncertainty, we will not lower ourselves, Mr. Speaker. Quite the opposite. We will raise them to catch the winds of economic change because we believe in Canada.
This fits with the theme of this year's budget, which is Canada Strong, and there are strong investments in certain areas. This includes $115 billion over 5 years for infrastructure, $110 billion over 5 years on increasing productivity and competitiveness, $30 billion over 5 years on defense and safety, and $25 billion over 5 years on housing. By the government's own measure, 75% of the budget is targeted toward responding to global economic shifts, including U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff threats. Indigenous people are mentioned only a handful of times in the Finance Minister's speech, and only in terms of their role in building Canada's economy.
And to do so, we will do that in a way that protects our future, that also protects our nature, and also protect our core values. Building a true partnership with Indigenous people whose stewardship and knowledge of the land continue to guide us today. Because we do not just build for ourselves. Because we do not build just for ourselves, we build for those who will follow us.
And likewise, there's only about $5.3 billion in new spending on Indigenous-specific priorities. This includes $2.3 billion over 5 years to address all First Nations infrastructure and water needs, $2 billion extra dollars for the Canada Infrastructure Bank to invest in Indigenous infrastructure, and $1 billion over 4 years as part of a new Arctic Infrastructure Fund. Perhaps most alarming for Indigenous stakeholders, there's no federal money targeted for First Nations education, Jordan's Principle, the Inuit Child First Initiative, or emergency response support beyond the 2025-2026 fiscal year. The government expects to save $60 billion over 5 years through what it calls a comprehensive expenditure review of the civil service. But funding at Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs and Indigenous Services is not expected to change during this time. The budget deficit is also expected to hit a whopping $78.3 billion in this fiscal year. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Prime Minister Mark Carney announced the second set of projects on Thursday afternoon that will be referred to the new Major Projects Office, where they are set to be fast-tracked through the regulatory process. 3 of the 6 projects have direct impacts on Indigenous communities. At a press conference in Terrace, BC, Carney announced 2 projects that will have direct impacts on Indigenous people in the region. Sea Lisms LNG is a proposed floating liquefied natural gas export facility located on a site owned by the Nisga'a Nation in northwest BC. Another project is the North Coast Transmission Line. It proposes to expand the electrical grid between Terrace and Prince George. The Prime Minister also referred the Iqaluit New Kiksotit hydro project to the Major Projects Office. The Inuit-owned project will help move Nunavut off diesel fuel to electrical power. Reporters asked Carney about Indigenous opposition to some of these projects, including the Sea Lisms LNG project.
Referring to the MPO, the Major Projects Office, does not mean the project is approved. It means that all the efforts are being put in place from the federal government in order to create the conditions so it could move forward. But those decisions are taken by many parties, including very much First Nations.
It was all smiles Thursday morning at a press conference in Calgary for the formal signing of the pipeline MOU between the Prime Minister and Alberta Premier.
At the core of the agreement, of course, is a priority to have a pipeline to Asia. That's going to make Canada stronger, more independent, more resilient, more sustainable.
As part of the MOU, the Government of Alberta commits to advance the development of a bitumen pipeline to Asian markets that offers opportunities for Indigenous co-ownership and other economic benefits. Use the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation to help backstop Indigenous co-ownership of the pipeline and extend the Alberta Carbon Capture Incentive Program. In return, Canada agrees to not implement the oil and gas emissions cap, immediately suspend the clean electricity regulations in Alberta pending a new carbon pricing agreement, declare the Alberta pipeline as a priority that offers opportunities for Indigenous co-ownership and as a project of national interest that will be referred to the Major Projects Office, use the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program to backstop Indigenous co-ownership of the pipeline. Later speaking to BC workers, Carney was asked by media about First Nations in the province that oppose an oil pipeline to the coast and had this to say.
There needs to be full partnership, including equity ownership, substantial economic benefits with First Nations in Alberta, First Nations in British Columbia, as well as agreement and substantial economic benefits for the people of British Columbia. So we look at this as the start of a process. We've created some of the necessary conditions for this to happen. But there's a lot more work to do, and very much in the spirit of partnership.
During question period in the House of Commons, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre said the Prime Minister and Liberal government have no intention of seeing an oil pipeline built.
What he will do is delay it for several years until after a prospective election during which he can dangle a possible pipeline in front of the people, but after which he can hand veto power that is not in the Constitution over to the BC NDP Premier, who will block the thing from ever happening. Isn't it true that this isn't a pipeline? It's a pipe dream.
Well, in a virtual press conference, Green Party leader Elizabeth May said the MOU completely rejects Canada's previous climate policy.
But this is simply unimaginable. This is a betrayal of so many different values, so many different agreements, so many different orders of rights and existing Canadian law. It completely sets the stage for the complete abandonment of Canada's climate policy. It is simply shocking.
Late Thursday afternoon on X, formerly known as Twitter, former Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault announced he is resigning from Cabinet as a result of the MOU. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Also announced late Thursday afternoon, Quebec Liberal MP Stephen Guilbeault said he was resigning from Prime Minister Mark Carney's cabinet. The decision comes after Carney and Smith signed Thursday's MOU for the proposed pipeline from Alberta to the West Coast. Guilbeault said he was quitting cabinet in protest of that pipeline pact and the possibility of the coastal tanker ban in BC being overturned for oil exports. Guilbeault was a cabinet minister for 6 years, with much of that time spent working under the former Trudeau government. The longtime environmentalist and activist was first a heritage minister, but moved to environment in 2021. He was then the Minister of Canadian Identity and Culture under Mark Carney. During his time as Environment Minister, he championed Trudeau's climate policies and heavily defended the carbon tax. There are rumors that his resignation is showing some cracks within the Liberal caucus. However, the Liberal Party says it remains united. In a statement from Guilbeault's resignation letter, he added there was no consultation with the Indigenous nations of the west coast of BC or with the provincial government, who would be greatly affected by this agreement. A pipeline to the west coast would have major environmental impacts, particularly as it could cross the Great Bear Rainforest, contribute to a significant increase in climate pollution, and move Canada further away from its greenhouse gas reduction targets. Guilbeault also says the possibility of lifting the tanker ban on the west coast would significantly increase the risk of accidents in the region and would hinder the creation of a marine conservation area in the Great Bear Sea. a project that the Feds, BC, and Indigenous leadership have been working towards for several years. He also says parts of Canada's climate action plan will soon be dismantled. He will stay within the Liberal caucus as an MP.
Thank you.
In her keynote speech Tuesday morning, AFN National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nepenak took direct aim at the Ottawa-Alberta MOU.
On the weekend, we saw a national report on the Alberta-Canada MOU state categorically that the mantra of free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous communities is gone, as if First Nations rights can be wiped away with one federal-provincial MOU. It was difficult to watch BC and many First Nations excluded from these discussions, particularly on the Pacific Coast.
She followed this up by saying if the Carney government plans to make Canada a worldwide energy leader, it will need to change its current approach to development projects that involve First Nations.
Over $600 billion of projects are forecast to be launched on our traditional lands over the next decade. The potential benefits are in the trillions of dollars, but they won't advance without First Nation support. Until an appropriate development process is established and founded in free, prior, and informed consent, the Crown's constitutional legal obligations will not be met. This is the law, and it can't be wished away.
The MOU is signed without input from the British Columbia government or coastal First Nations. It opens the door to a number of legislative changes for a proposed pipeline from Alberta to the West Coast, including lifting a long-held oil taker ban in the area. This doesn't sit right with the old Masset Village Council from Haida Gwaii, which put forward an emergency resolution against the proposed pipeline.
The Oil Tanker Moratorium Act is vital legislation as a result of over 50-year moratorium that is a result of recognized BC North and Central Coast are some of the most dangerous waters in the world. An oil spill in the area is not an if, it is when.
Late Tuesday afternoon, the Prime Minister himself addressed the Assembly. He said earlier in the new year, the government will be hosting a joint federal, provincial, territorial First Ministers meeting with First Nations. And the Liberals will also introduce First Nations clean water legislation in the spring, originally promised this fall. Carney also said projects like the proposed pipeline must be seen as a beginning and not an end. During the question and answer, Neskantaga First Nation Chief Gary Cuisis took the Prime Minister to task for failing to lift a boil water advisory in his community for over 3 decades.
And hearing you comments that you've been lifting boil water advisories in Canada, but I don't know which part of country you're talking about that's water is being lifted, but our community hasn't been lifted for 30 years.
In his answer, Carney admitted the government had failed the community.
And that's a failure, to be absolutely clear. You know it's a failure. You've lived through it most of your adult life. It's a failure of execution, and this is one of the things that this government is very focused on, is setting objectives, being clear about the objectives, determining why things have not worked as well as they should.
Carney stopped the Q&A before all chiefs could speak, upsetting Cold Lake First Nation Chief Kelsey Jacko.
Chief Jacko, please. We understand.
The Assembly enters its second day on Wednesday. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.